The desert was wide and endless. Sand stretched as far as the eye could see, broken only by a few low hills and the thin line of a stream that cut across the valley. Tomasz had lived there for many years. His small hut stood near the water, built from stone and wood he had gathered with his own hands. Around it stood a small corral where he kept his horses. Once, he had many, but now only two remained. They were his last companions, strong but weary, much like him. That evening, the air was still. The sun had fallen low, painting the sand in red and gold. Tomasz was walking back from the stream with a bucket of water when he noticed something unusual. At first, he thought it was a fallen tree branch, strange in a land with no trees. But as he stepped closer, he saw it was not wood. It was a figure, lying motionless by the edge of the stream. Tomasz's heart quickened. He set the bucket down and hurried forward. As he bent near, he realized it was a woman. Yet she was not like any woman he had ever seen. Her skin held a faint shimmer, almost as if the light of the setting sun rested inside it. Her hair was long, pale as silver, and her clothing was torn from travel. She looked fragile, yet there was strength in the way her hands were curled, as if she had fought against exhaustion until the very end. She was breathing, but only barely. Her chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm. Her lips were dry and cracked. Tomasz knelt beside her, unsure of what to do. He had heard stories of strangers from the sky. Travelers who came in silence, who did not belong to the world he knew. Some said they were dangerous. Others said they carried wisdom far beyond human understanding. But Tomasz did not think of stories now. He saw only a wounded soul, one step away from death. Without hesitation, he lifted her gently in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and he could feel the weakness in her body. The camp was not far, but walking through sand with another person in his arms was no easy task. His breath grew heavy as he moved, yet he did not stop. When his strength began to fade, he whistled sharply. From the corral, one of his horses raised its head. The animal trotted forward, and Tomasz guided it closer. With care, he placed the woman across its back. She did not stir. Her head rested against the horse's mane, her silver hair catching the last rays of the sun. Tomasz held the reins and walked beside them, steadying her with one arm. His boots sank into the sand, but he pressed on until they reached the small hut. Inside, the air was cool compared to the desert heat. Tomasz laid her on a blanket near the fire pit. He fetched water from the bucket and dipped a cloth to wet her lips. Slowly, a drop of water touched her mouth. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes unlike any he had ever seen. They were a deep shade of violet, glowing softly in the dim light. She looked at him for only a moment before her eyes closed again. Tomasz felt she had seen him, understood that he meant no harm. He gave her more water, letting her drink in small sips. She coughed weakly, but soon her breathing grew steadier. Night fell, and stars appeared above the desert. Tomasz lit a small fire, its crackle filling the silence. He glanced at the woman often, wondering who she was. Her clothing was made of a fabric he did not know, thin yet strong. Her boots were worn, covered in dust from long travel. She carried no weapon, no pack, nothing but herself. He spoke softly, though he knew she could not understand. "You are safe here," he said. His voice was low, steady, like one would use with a frightened horse. "Rest. The desert will not take you tonight." The woman did not reply, but her breathing told him she was listening in her own way. Tomasz moved to the corral and checked on his other horse. He gave both animals water and a little grain. As he brushed their coats, he thought about what he had done. He had given his strongest horse to carry her. That horse was his last hope for long travel, the one he trusted most. Yet he did not regret it. Life, he believed, was worth more than any possession. When he returned to the hut, the woman stirred again. Her hand moved weakly, pointing toward the sky. Tomasz followed her gesture. Above them, the stars shone brighter than ever. He wondered if she came from one of those distant lights. Perhaps her home was up there, far beyond his reach. He sat near the fire and watched over her. The desert night grew colder, but he kept the flames alive. The silence of the land pressed in, broken only by the crackle of burning wood and the soft breath of the stranger he had saved. Tomasz thought of his past, of the years when his horses had been many, when travelers had passed through the valley. Those days were gone, leaving only solitude. Yet now, by chance or fate, someone had come. Not a traveler of his world, but one from beyond it. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. Perhaps she would wake and leave. Perhaps others would come for her. Or perhaps she would never open her eyes again. All Tomasz knew was that, in this moment, she was alive because he had chosen to help. As the fire burned low, he added more wood. He wrapped a blanket around her, careful not to disturb her rest. Then he leaned back, eyes on the stars once more. The desert was still, but in that stillness, something new had begun. The first light of morning crept across the desert. Pale gold spread over the horizon, touching the sand, the stones, and the thin line of the stream. The hut stood quiet. Inside, the fire had burned low during the night, leaving only a faint glow. Tomasz rose from his blanket and looked at the woman lying near the hearth. She had not moved much, but her breathing was steady now. Tomasz poured water into a clay cup. He knelt beside her and lifted her head gently. Her eyes opened, violet and watchful, though weak. She drank slowly, each sip a small victory. When the cup was empty, she let out a faint sound, something like a word, though Tomasz could not understand it. He nodded to her, speaking softly. "You are safe here. Rest." Her eyes followed him as he stood and moved around the room. Tomasz made a simple meal of flat bread and dried fruit. He placed a piece of bread near her, showing her that it was food. She touched it carefully, as if uncertain, then tasted a small bite. It seemed to give her strength. The silence between them was heavy, but not cold. They did not share words, yet there was a sense of fragile trust beginning to form. Tomasz kept his movements slow, steady, so she would not think he meant harm. She watched him closely, but her eyes no longer carried only fear. Later that morning, Tomasz led one of his horses to the stream. He carried buckets of water back to the hut and poured some into a bowl for the woman. She cupped the water in her hands, drinking with quiet dignity. Though weak, she carried herself with grace. Tomasz noticed the torn fabric of her clothing. The cloth was unlike anything he knew, thin yet strong, almost shining in the light. He wondered if it had once been a uniform or a traveler's garment from a place far beyond his world. He wanted to ask her, but words failed. So he simply nodded, letting her see that he cared. When the sun grew high, Tomasz offered her shade beneath the small roof outside the hut. He helped her sit up and guided her to the doorway. She leaned on him, her steps unsteady, but she did not pull away. Together they sat in the shade, looking out at the endless sand. The desert was quiet, broken only by the sound of wind moving through dry grass. The woman raised her hand and pointed toward the horizon. She spoke a word again, soft but clear. Tomasz did not understand, but he looked where she pointed. The horizon was empty. He thought she might be searching for something or someone. Her eyes seemed to carry both hope and sorrow. Tomasz answered in his own way. He placed his hand over his chest and said his name. Tomasz. He repeated it slowly, letting the sound carry. Then he pointed toward her with gentle curiosity. She studied him, then touched her own chest. A faint sound left her lips. It was her name, though spoken in a way he could barely repeat. The sound was soft, almost like the wind across stone. Tomasz tried to say it, though clumsy on his tongue. She gave the smallest smile, a spark of warmth that broke the distance between them. The rest of the day passed in quiet rhythm. Tomasz tended the horses, gathered wood, and kept the fire alive. The woman watched him work, sometimes closing her eyes to rest, sometimes following his movements with sharp attention. When he brought food again, she accepted it with a nod. When he gave her water, she lifted the cup herself, showing her strength returning. In the evening, as the sun sank low, Tomasz sat by the fire. The woman sat across from him, wrapped in a blanket. The flames painted light across her face, softening her features. She looked at him, then pointed to the sky through the open doorway. Stars were beginning to appear, one by one. She spoke again, a longer string of words this time. Though he could not understand, her tone was calm, almost thoughtful, as if she were telling him something important. Tomasz listened. He did not interrupt. He only nodded, letting her know he was hearing her, even if he could not grasp her meaning. At last, she fell silent. She looked at him with eyes that held both distance and closeness. It was as if she lived in two worlds at once, one he could not see, and one she had been forced to share with him. Tomasz spoke in return, though his words were plain. He told her about the desert, about the horses, about the stream that had kept him alive for so many years. His voice was low and steady, carrying across the quiet night. She listened as he spoke, though she could not know his words. Yet she seemed to understand something in his tone, for her gaze softened. The night grew colder. Tomasz added wood to the fire. The woman lay down again, her strength not yet whole. Before closing her eyes, she looked at him once more, and for the first time, there was no fear in her face. Only trust, fragile but real. Tomasz sat awake long after she slept. The desert outside was silent, but he felt a new presence in his life, one that filled the emptiness of many lonely years. He did not know who she was or where she had come from. But he knew she had chosen to trust him, and that was enough for now. He whispered into the stillness, more to himself than to her. Tomorrow will bring what it brings. Tonight, you are safe. The fire burned steady, the stars turned slowly above, and the fragile bond between two distant worlds took root in the quiet desert night. The desert grew quiet as the sun slipped below the horizon. Shadows stretched across the sand, long and thin, until the whole valley sank into darkness. The stars appeared one by one, bright and countless, filling the sky with a soft glow. The stream whispered in the distance, its trickle the only sound apart from the crackle of firewood. Tomasz sat near the flames, his back against the stone wall of the hut. Across from him, the woman lay beneath a blanket, her violet eyes closed, her breathing calm. She had eaten little, but enough to give her strength. She had spoken only a few words in her strange tongue, but her gaze had carried meaning. Tomasz rested one hand on his knee and listened to the night. He was used to silence, for silence had been his companion for years. Yet tonight felt different. The silence was not empty. It carried weight, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The horses shifted in the corral, hooves tapping softly against the ground. Tomasz looked toward them. They were uneasy, heads lifted, ears twitching at sounds he could not hear. He stood and walked to them, his boots pressing into the cool sand. He patted their necks, murmuring calm words. The horses breathed heavily for a moment, then settled under his touch. When he turned back toward the hut, the woman was awake again. She was sitting upright, the blanket around her shoulders. The firelight touched her silver hair, casting it in soft lines of light and shadow. Her eyes met his, sharp and alert despite her weakness. Tomasz walked back slowly, not wanting to startle her. He lowered himself to the ground by the fire. For a time, they simply looked at each other, neither speaking. At last, she lifted her hand and pointed upward. Her lips moved, forming a word he did not know. She traced the line of stars with her finger, her expression distant. Tomasz followed her gesture. The sky was wide and endless, filled with constellations he had studied since boyhood. He wondered if one of those faraway lights was her home. Perhaps her people lived under skies like this, looking down on other worlds. Perhaps she had crossed those distances to arrive here, broken and lost. The woman lowered her hand. She shivered slightly, and Tomasz pushed a small log into the fire. Sparks rose into the air before fading into the night. "You are safe," Tomasz said softly. He knew she would not understand the words, but he hoped the sound of his voice would reach her. She watched him closely, her head tilted as if listening not to his words but to the tone beneath them. Then she gave the faintest nod, a small sign that trust was growing. Hours passed. The desert cooled further, and the fire's warmth was precious. Tomasz kept feeding the flames, unwilling to let the night grow too cold for her. He fought sleep, his eyes heavy, but he would not close them while she was still so fragile. He felt it was his duty to guard her, though he did not know why. At one point, she stirred again. She reached toward the cup of water by her side but her hand trembled. Tomasz moved quickly, offering it to her. She drank slowly, her eyes never leaving his. When she finished, she whispered something in her language, soft and careful. Though he did not know the meaning, he felt it was a word of thanks. The silence stretched again, but it was no longer heavy. It was a silence filled with presence, the kind that needed no words. The firelight danced on the walls, the stream whispered beyond the hut, and above them the stars turned their slow circles. Tomasz leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. Memories rose in his mind. He remembered nights when his valley had been filled with laughter, when traders passed through and shared food and stories. He remembered when his herd of horses had been large, their hoofbeats echoing across the plain. Those days had faded, leaving only quiet years. Yet now, with a stranger resting near his fire, the silence felt less like loneliness and more like waiting. The woman lay down once more, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Her breathing grew steady again. Tomasz listened until he was sure she slept. Then he rose quietly and stepped outside. The desert stretched before him, silver under starlight. The sand glimmered faintly, and the wind carried a cool edge. He looked toward the hills. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a flicker of light far away, like a star that had fallen too close to the ground. But when he blinked, it was gone. Perhaps it was only his eyes, tired from the long day. Still, the horses shifted again, ears pricked. Tomasz frowned but did not call out. He knew the desert often played tricks at night. He returned to the hut and checked the fire. The woman was still asleep, her face peaceful. Tomasz sat once more, pulling his blanket around his shoulders. He kept his eyes on the flames, but part of his mind remained on the horizon. Something was out there. He could not say what, but the feeling would not leave him. As the night deepened, the stars seemed brighter than ever. Tomasz whispered a quiet prayer to the silent desert, though he was not sure who might hear. Perhaps it was only for himself, or perhaps for the woman who had crossed such great distance to arrive at his door. He stayed awake until the faintest light touched the eastern sky. The desert night had been long, but it passed without danger. The woman had rested, the fire had kept them warm, and Tomasz had kept his watch. Yet in the silence of that night, something unseen had stirred. The first light of dawn crept over the desert. The sand turned from silver to gold, and the long shadows of night began to fade. Tomasz had not slept. He sat near the fire, watching the woman as she rested under her blanket. She looked stronger than before, her breathing calm, her face no longer pale with weakness. The fire had grown low, so Tomasz stood and stepped outside. The air was cool, the kind of coolness that only came before sunrise. He filled a bucket from the stream and returned to the hut. When he set it down, the woman stirred. Her violet eyes opened, adjusting to the soft light. She looked at him and then at the water. Tomasz lifted a cup, offered it to her, and waited as she drank slowly. After a moment, she pushed herself up on her elbows, moving with effort but also with determination. Tomasz helped her sit against the wall. She gave a small nod, as if to say she was ready to face the morning. As the sun climbed higher, Tomasz stepped outside again. He paused, his eyes narrowing. Far on the horizon, shadows moved across the sand. At first, he thought it was the wind stirring dust. But these shapes did not fade or scatter. They grew clearer with each moment. Figures, tall and graceful, gliding in silence toward the valley. Tomasz's breath caught. He counted at least 6, maybe more, moving in perfect rhythm. They were not human. Even from a distance, he could see the faint shimmer of their skin, silver against the golden light. They were like the woman in his hut. They were her people. He turned back inside quickly. The woman had already sensed it. She was sitting upright now, her eyes wide, her face lit with both hope and relief. She tried to stand, but her legs trembled. Tomasz rushed to her side, steadying her. She pointed toward the horizon, speaking a word with strength he had not heard from her before. Her sisters were coming. Tomasz helped her to the doorway. Together they stood in the shade as the sun rose higher. The figures drew closer, their movement quiet, almost floating across the sand. Their robes or garments flowed like water, their steps leaving barely a trace. They carried no visible weapons. They came in silence, yet their presence filled the valley with something powerful, something Tomasz could feel deep in his chest. When they reached the hut, they stopped as one. The air grew heavy, as if the desert itself had paused. The sisters looked at Tomasz, their eyes the same deep violet as the woman he had saved. Their gazes were calm, steady, but unreadable. The wounded woman stepped forward, leaning on Tomasz for balance. She spoke words in her own language, her voice quiet but clear. The sisters listened, their heads tilting slightly. Then one of them stepped closer. She touched the wounded woman's shoulder, her expression soft. A bond passed between them, something Tomasz could not understand but could feel. For a moment, all eyes turned to him. Tomasz stood tall, though his heart pounded. He had lived a life of solitude, but never had he faced such a sight. 6 strangers from beyond his world, watching him with silent judgment. He did not know what they thought of him, or what they planned to do. The woman he had saved spoke again, her hand lifting slightly toward Tomasz. The sisters glanced at one another. Their expressions did not change much, but Tomasz sensed that his act had been understood. They knew he had given care when no one else could. The leader of the group, taller than the rest, stepped forward. She studied Tomasz carefully, her violet eyes deep as the desert night. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she inclined her head, a small but deliberate gesture. Tomasz understood. It was respect. The sisters moved to support the wounded woman. She released Tomasz's arm, though she looked back at him once, her gaze holding gratitude. The others formed a circle around her, shielding her gently as they prepared to leave. Tomasz felt a strange ache in his chest. He had only known her for a short time, yet her presence had filled the silence of his world. He had shared water, food, and fire. He had watched her fight for each breath. Now she was leaving, and though it was what she needed, it left him hollow. Still, he did not move to stop them. He only stood by the doorway, watching as they turned toward the horizon. Their steps were silent, their shapes moving like a single wave across the sand. The rising sun cast long shadows behind them, stretching across the valley floor. Tomasz's horse whinnied softly, as if sensing the moment. The sound echoed against the still air, but the sisters did not look back. Only the wounded woman turned her head once more. Her eyes met Tomasz's, and in that glance was a promise, though no words were spoken. Then they were gone, moving farther across the desert, their forms growing smaller with each step. The silence they left behind was vast, deeper than before. The stream trickled, the horses shifted, and the fire inside the hut smoldered low. Tomasz stood for a long time, staring at the horizon where they had disappeared. The crystal sky stretched above him, bright and endless. He thought of the moment he had found her by the stream, broken and near death. He thought of the nights spent keeping her alive. Now she was gone, taken by those who belonged to her. He turned back into the hut. The blanket she had used still lay on the ground, carrying the faintest trace of her presence. Tomasz folded it slowly, placing it to the side. He poured water into a cup and set it down, though he knew it would remain untouched. The desert was quiet once more, yet it did not feel the same. Something had changed, something invisible but lasting. Tomasz could not name it, but he felt it deep within. He stepped outside again, the sun warm on his face. He looked at his horses, at the stream, at the endless sand. Life in the valley would continue as before, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like waiting, as if the desert itself knew the story was not finished. Tomasz whispered into the still air, "Safe travels." The words vanished into the wind, but he hoped they would reach her, wherever her path might lead. The morning sun rose higher, pouring light across the desert. Tomasz stood outside the hut, his eyes following the distant figures of the alien women. They moved with silent grace, carrying the wounded one among them. He thought they would leave at once, disappearing into the horizon, yet they did not. Instead, they stopped only a short distance from the hut. The women formed a circle around their wounded sister. Their garments shimmered faintly in the sunlight, and their tall forms seemed both strong and gentle. For a while, they spoke in low tones, words carried in a language Tomasz could not understand. The sound was soft, almost like the rustle of wind through reeds. Tomasz stayed still. He knew it was not his place to step forward. He simply watched, his hands resting at his sides. His horses shifted behind him, uneasy but not fearful. The desert was calm, yet the air seemed charged with meaning. At last, the circle of women turned their attention toward him. Their violet eyes, so alike to the one he had saved, studied him carefully. Their gazes were not hostile, yet they held weight. Tomasz felt as if they were seeing not just his body but his spirit. He had faced storms, droughts, and long years of loneliness, but this silent attention was unlike anything he had known. The wounded woman spoke then. She pointed to Tomasz, her voice quiet but steady. Though the words were foreign, her tone carried gratitude. The sisters listened, nodding slightly as she explained. Tomasz did not need to understand the language to know she was telling them about his kindness, about the water he had given, about the horse he had sacrificed to carry her from the stream. One of the sisters, smaller than the rest, stepped forward. She looked at Tomasz with eyes that seemed softer than the others. She lifted her hand in a slow gesture, palm open, showing no threat. Tomasz did the same, raising his hand carefully. For a moment, their hands faced one another, though they did not touch. It was enough to bridge the silence. The taller one, perhaps their leader, moved next. She walked with dignity, her steps measured, until she stood before Tomasz. She was taller than him, her silver hair catching the sunlight. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she inclined her head slightly, the same gesture she had given before. Tomasz bowed his head in return. He had lived among humans all his life, yet this small exchange felt greater than any spoken word. It was respect, shared across the gulf of two worlds. The leader turned and spoke to her sisters. They nodded, their faces calm but focused. The wounded woman gave Tomasz one last look, her lips curving into the faintest smile. It was not a smile of joy, but of trust, as if she wished him to know that his part in her story would not be forgotten. The group shifted slightly, still near the hut but no longer moving to leave. Tomasz realized they were waiting. For what, he did not know. Perhaps they were preparing for a journey. Perhaps they needed time before traveling again. Whatever the reason, they remained, their presence filling the valley with quiet power. Tomasz returned to the doorway of his hut. He did not speak, but he kept watch. He noticed how the sisters moved with harmony. Each one seemed to know the thoughts of the others without needing words. When one reached for water, another was already holding a vessel. When one adjusted the blanket on the wounded woman, another steadied her gently. Their care for one another was deep, unspoken, and precise. The desert sun climbed higher. Heat began to rise from the sand, and Tomasz knew the day would soon be harsh. He stepped back inside his hut, fetched a jar of water, and carried it outside. He placed it on the ground near the sisters, then stepped away. For a moment, none of them moved. Then the smaller sister approached, lifting the jar with graceful hands. She poured some into a bowl and offered it to the wounded woman. The others watched Tomasz with those deep violet eyes, but their gazes had softened. They had seen his gesture, and they understood it. The leader gave another slight nod. It was not a smile, but it was acknowledgement. The rest of the day passed slowly. The sisters did not speak much, though their presence was constant. Tomasz went about his tasks, feeding the horses, gathering wood, and tending to the stream. He felt their eyes on him from time to time, not with suspicion but with quiet observation. It was as if they wanted to know who he truly was. As evening approached, the desert cooled. The sky burned with colors of orange and red before sinking into purple. Tomash lit his fire again, and the flames cast long shadows across the ground. The sisters remained outside, their circle tight around the wounded one. At one point, Tomash thought he heard a sound carried on the wind. It was not words, but a song. The sisters were singing softly, their voices weaving together in tones that rose and fell like the rhythm of the earth itself. The sound was gentle, but it filled the valley, touching even the horses, who grew calm and still. Tomash listened, his heart heavy yet peaceful. He did not understand the meaning of the song, but he felt its truth. It was a song of care, of endurance, of journeys that stretched across vast distances. It was a song of sisters bound by something deeper than he could name. When the song faded, the night was quiet again. The stars appeared, bright and endless. Tomash sat near his fire, his thoughts turning over and over. He knew the sisters would not stay forever. Their presence was like the wind passing through, leaving marks but never remaining. Yet in their silence, in their song, in their respect, they had given him something he could not explain. The wounded woman looked at him once more before she lay down to rest. Her eyes lingered on him in the firelight, and though she said nothing, Tomash felt her words in his heart. "Thank you." The desert night wrapped around them. Tomash leaned back, eyes on the stars. The sisters kept their silent watch, and the valley held its breath again. Something was changing, something unseen but certain, as if the desert itself waited for what would come next. The night passed slowly, wrapped in stillness. Tomash dozed lightly near the fire, his head resting against the stone wall of the hut. Outside, the sisters kept their circle, their tall forms unmoving, their eyes turned toward the stars. The desert was calm, and the stream whispered softly in the dark. When dawn came, the air was cool and fresh. A faint breeze stirred the sand, carrying the scent of dry grass. Tomash rose from his place, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. He stepped outside and found the sisters already awake, standing in a half-circle as the morning light touched the valley. Their wounded kin was stronger now, her back straight as she sat among them. Tomash watched quietly. He thought they might leave at once, heading back to whatever far place had brought them here. Yet they did not move to depart. Instead, the leader of the group turned and walked toward him. Her steps were slow, deliberate. The desert sand did not crunch under her feet, nor did the breeze disturb her robes. She stopped before him and lifted her hand. In her palm rested a small object. It was no stone, no metal, no crystal he had ever seen. It was clear like glass, yet it glowed faintly with a light that was not from the sun. Its surface shimmered with shifting colors, soft and deep, as if holding the memory of the stars themselves. She held it out to him without a word. Tomash hesitated. He looked at the object, then at her face. Her violet eyes were calm, steady, filled with quiet purpose. He understood that this was not a burden she was giving, but a gift. Slowly, he reached out. His calloused hands closed around the smooth, warm surface of the crystal. The moment he touched it, a faint warmth spread through his chest. It was not fire, not heat, but something gentler, like the comfort of the first sunbeam after a long cold night. He held it carefully, almost afraid it might vanish if he gripped too hard. The leader stepped back. The other sisters turned their eyes to him, and for the first time since they had arrived, Tomash thought he saw a change in their expressions. Their faces softened, no longer only calm and distant. They were acknowledging him, not just as a man who had given water and shelter, but as one who had been chosen to receive their trust. The wounded woman rose then, leaning lightly on one of her sisters. She walked a few steps toward Tomasz, her movements still slow but steady. She placed her hand over her chest, then extended it toward him. Her lips moved, forming words in her own language. Though Tomasz could not understand, the tone was clear. It was gratitude. Tomasz bowed his head slightly. "You are welcome," he said quietly. His voice was rough, but it carried all the truth of his heart. The crystal pulsed faintly in his hand, as if it had heard. He wondered what it truly was. Perhaps it was a piece of their world, carried across the stars. Perhaps it held knowledge or power beyond his understanding. Or perhaps it was something simpler, a token of memory, a way of saying his kindness would not be forgotten. The sisters regrouped, gathering close around the wounded one once more. They spoke together in their soft language, the sound weaving like a low song. Tomasz stood apart, holding the crystal, the sunlight now catching its surface and scattering colors across his skin. As the sun climbed higher, the leader gave a final nod. It was a gesture both farewell and blessing. The group began to move, their steps slow but certain, heading toward the horizon. The wounded woman glanced back once, her eyes meeting Tomasz's. It was a look that said more than words could carry. Then she turned and walked with her sisters, their figures gliding across the sand. Tomasz stood long after they had gone, the crystal heavy in his hand. He lifted it to the light, watching the colors shift and dance. Though he did not know its meaning, he knew it was precious. Not because of what it might do, but because of what it represented. He returned to his hut and placed it carefully on the small table near the fire. It glowed faintly even in the shadows, a quiet reminder of what had passed. He sat down, staring at it, his thoughts turning slowly. For many years, Tomasz had lived alone in the valley. His horses were his only companions, his days filled with simple work. He had asked little from the world and expected nothing in return. Yet in a single moment, when he had lifted a stranger from the sand, his life had touched a story greater than his own. Now he held proof of that story, a gift from those who had crossed the stars. It was more than a token. It was a bridge between his world and theirs, a promise that kindness was seen even in the quietest corners of the desert. The day grew warmer. Tomasz fed the horses, drew water from the stream, and carried wood for the evening fire. His tasks were the same as always, yet everything felt different. When the wind stirred, he thought of the sisters' voices, soft and steady. When the stars began to appear, he thought of the wounded woman pointing toward them, her eyes filled with longing. At night, he sat by the fire with the crystal in his hands. It glowed faintly, casting gentle light across the walls of his hut. Tomasz felt no loneliness. The desert was vast, the silence deep, but he knew he was no longer alone in spirit. Somewhere beyond the stars, the sisters remembered him, just as he remembered them. He whispered into the stillness, "Safe travels." The crystal shimmered once, faint but clear, as if answering. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Life in the desert returned to its rhythm, yet for Tomasz nothing felt quite the same. The crystal remained in his hut, glowing softly every night, never fading. It became part of his world, like the fire, the horses, and the stream. Yet each time he looked at it, he remembered the sisters, their silent watch, and the gift they had left behind. The seasons shifted. The air grew colder, the nights sharper. Tomasz wrapped himself in old blankets by the fire, listening to the wind whistle across the valley. He worked as he always had, tending his horses, drawing water, mending the roof of his hut. But the desert no longer felt empty. He often paused in his work, gazing at the horizon as though expecting to see tall, graceful figures walking once more across the sand. One morning, before the sun had risen, he woke suddenly. The fire was low, the crystal glowing faintly on the table. The air felt different, not colder, not warmer, but alive. He rose to his feet, stepping outside into the pale light of dawn. The valley was silent, yet the silence was heavy with meaning. The sky in the east brightened slowly, streaks of gold pushing back the night. As Tomasz watched, the glow of the crystal in his hut grew stronger, spilling light through the doorway. He turned back, eyes narrowing. The crystal pulsed, not wildly, but steadily, like a calm heartbeat. It filled the small hut with soft radiance, spilling across the floor and walls. Tomasz stepped closer, reaching out. The moment his hand touched it, warmth spread through his arm, across his chest, and into his heart. He closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyes, he saw them. The sisters. Tall, silent, standing together beneath the stars. The wounded woman, now whole, looked straight at him. Her eyes were clear, filled with strength. She raised her hand, as if in farewell, yet her expression was not sorrowful. It was peaceful. The vision faded, leaving Tomasz standing in the glow of the crystal. He breathed slowly, steadying himself. He did not fully understand, but he knew this was their way of speaking to him across the distance of stars. It was their way of saying he was remembered. The sun rose over the horizon, its first light pouring across the desert. Tomasz carried the crystal outside, holding it against the new day. The light of the sun and the glow of the crystal mingled, one gold, the other silver, weaving together in harmony. For a brief moment, the valley seemed brighter than it had ever been. The horses shifted restlessly but without fear. They lifted their heads, as if sensing the same unseen presence Tomasz felt in his chest. He stood in silence, holding the crystal high until the warmth became almost too much to bear. Then he lowered it gently, cradling it in both hands. As days passed, the crystal began to change. Its glow, once steady and constant, grew softer with each night. Tomasz realized it was fading, not as a loss, but as a completion. The gift had served its purpose. It had carried the sister's memory to him, reminding him that his kindness had crossed beyond his small valley. Now, it was preparing to rest. One evening, as the sky deepened into twilight, Tomasz placed the crystal on the small rise above the stream. He did not bury it, nor did he hide it. He left it there, resting in the open air, where the stars could see it. The glow dimmed gently, like a lantern running low. Tomasz sat nearby, watching in silence. He did not try to stop it. He simply bore witness, as he had when he first found the wounded woman at the stream. The light flickered, then grew still. The crystal remained, clear and beautiful, but no longer shining. Tomasz picked it up one last time. It was cool now, but smooth, still holding the shape of its gift. He placed it on a flat stone near the water, where the desert wind would pass and the stars would watch. He whispered, "Thank you." The stream carried the sound away, soft and endless. The years moved on. Tomasz grew older, his hair turning white, his steps slower. Yet he never left the valley. Travelers came and went, passing through on their way to other lands. Some stayed a night, sharing fire and food, listening to his quiet voice tell stories. He never told them everything, but he spoke of kindness, of the power in helping a stranger, and of the ways small acts could echo beyond sight. Those who listened carried his words onward, across deserts, mountains, and rivers. And though they did not know the full truth, they remembered. When Tamash's last morning came, it was quiet. The sun rose over the valley, gold and soft. The horses stood still, the stream whispered, and the desert seemed to hold its breath. Tamash sat near the flat stone by the water, the crystal beside him, now only clear but still beautiful. He looked at the horizon one last time, eyes steady. The sky brightened, and in the corner of his vision, he thought he saw tall figures standing in the sunlight. Graceful, silent, waiting. He closed his eyes, a faint smile on his face. The desert remained, endless and calm. The crystal rested on the stone, a story carved in silence. And far beyond the stars, the sisters remembered the man who gave his last horse to a wounded traveler at sunrise.